Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi. My name is Adam Van Couverden. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change and the Member of Parliament for Milton. Welcome to today's announcement on the release of the 2024 National Inventory Report. There's been a lot of hot air about the impact and effectiveness of climate action these days. We hear it every day in the House of Commons. But there is one bottom line measure that defies the misinformation merchants and the climate action cynics, and that's the annual National Inventory Report, which every country must compile and provide to the United Nations in accordance with the Paris Accord. To continue reducing emissions, scientists and policymakers need to understand how much and where greenhouse gas pollution comes from. And the only way to know if we are on track to meet our ambitious goals is to monitor them with reliable emissions inventory tracking. This is important to understanding Canada's progress, but also to determine next steps in climate action. This progress helps all Canadians, our health, the safety of our communities, job prospects, investment opportunities, and sustained, clean economic growth for this decade and for decades to come. Pierre Poilievre and his fellow Conservatives want to kick the legs out from under this success story. They want to grind climate action to a halt and ignore the facts, evidence, and science in favor of big polluters. That's why the National Inventory Report is so important, to keep us all honest about what is happening with our emissions and to track that progress so we can see clearly, with math, which climate policies are working best to lower our emissions. The NIR represents facts versus partisan fiction. And the fact is, progress on fighting climate change here in Canada is happening. Canada has been a leader, and we are focused and relentless in taking climate action. And it's my pleasure to introduce Minister Steven Guilbeault. Over to you, Steven.
Merci, bonjour tout le monde. Et vraiment désolé, lorsqu'on avait prévu cette conférence de presse-là ce matin, on ne savait pas qu'il y aurait un vote dans 14 minutes. Alors, je vais essayer de faire ça vite. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining us today in Ottawa. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, who for generations have been steward of this land. Alors, depuis 2015, nous avons poursuivi notre mission sans relâche, préparer le Canada pour la réalité économique du 21e siècle et celle des changements climatiques. Parce qu'en fait, ces deux réalités, l'environnement et l'économie, sont la même. Réduire concrètement la pollution dans une économie en croissance, c'est la clé du succès, et tout le monde sur la planète se fait compétition pour exploiter tout le potentiel rattaché à ce changement. If you stand in the way of clean energy development and pollution reduction, you're standing in the way of sustained economic success for Canadians. Today, I'm releasing Canada's 2024 National Inventory Report, which tracks and reports on countries' GHG emissions. This year's edition provides estimates from 1990 to 2022. The report shows that Canada remains on track to meet our emission reduction goals of 2026 and on track towards 2030. And we're doing this as our economy rebounds strongly from the global impact of the pandemic. We knew emissions were going to bounce back in 2022 as our economy burst back to life. And we did see emissions increase between 2021 and 2022 in the transportation sector, the building and housing sector, and some parts of the oil and gas, notably oil sands. But overall, this updated report shows significantly lower emissions by 44 million tons than our pre-pandemic levels. That is the equivalent of removing 13 million vehicles from our roads. In fact, emissions are at their lowest they've been in 25 years, with the exception of 2020 and 2021 during COVID. And today's NIR shows that the expected 2022 emissions rebound has actually come in below the levels that were predicted both by the Government of Canada and the Canadian Climate Institute. This is thanks to the most comprehensive and sustained series of climate plans from any federal government in Canada's history. Most recently, the Sector-by-Sector 2030 Emissions Reduction Report. We need everyone to help drive down the emissions that are already fueling costly climate impacts, like wildfires that damaged so much of Canada last year and threatens to do so again this year. That's why we cannot pause or start throwing environmental measures overboard in the pursuit of short-term partisan gain. And we are going to keep up the momentum with new measures like the oil and gas emissions cap and investment in electric vehicle supply chains. We just saw with Honda's major investment in Canada that our climate and economic strategy is already paying off. Le rapport d'inventaire 2024 fait état d'émissions inférieures de 44 millions de tonnes par rapport au niveau d'avant la pandémie, soit l'équivalent de retirer de nos routes 13 millions de véhicules. En fait, les émissions n'ont jamais été aussi faibles en 25 ans au Canada, à l'exception des années de la COVID en 2020 et 2021. Que dit donc ce rapport sur l'avenir au Canada? Il confirme que la croissance économique du pays continue à se découpler des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. L'intensité des émissions canadiennes a diminué de 42 % depuis 1990. Nos efforts acharnés portent leurs fruits. Nous sommes sur la bonne voie et nous devons continuer dans cette direction. Ce n'est pas le moment d'arrêter le progrès. Nous devons poursuivre sur notre lancée avec de nouvelles mesures comme le plafonnement des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier et des investissements dans la chaîne d'approvisionnement des véhicules électriques. Et malgré l'obstruction et le déni chez certains de nos critiques, comme le chef de l'opposition, il reste que la tarification carbone associée à des investissements dans la recherche et le développement aide à développer l'économie canadienne. Qu'on parle d'extraction de minéraux critiques, de technologies propres ou encore de fabrication dans le domaine de l'électrification. Ces mesures sont essentielles pour veiller à ce que nos enfants et nos petits-enfants héritent d'un pays où l'environnement est protégé et où l'air est sûr et propre. Merci beaucoup.
Vous avez inauguré le pipeline Trans Mountain déjà. En quoi ça ne va pas nuire à vos efforts?
Ce qu'on fait, comme vous le savez, l'utilisation des ressources naturelles est de compétence provinciale. Or, ce que nous faisons, que ce soit à travers le règlement sur le méthane, qui va faire en sorte, et on le voit dans le rapport que les émissions de méthane dans le secteur du pétrole et du gaz ont déjà commencé à diminuer. Nous avons un nouveau, elles devront diminuer de 40 % d'ici 2025. Nous mettons en place un plafond sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, le règlement sur l'électricité propre d'ici 2035, donc pour d'une part réduire l'utilisation des combustibles fossiles dans la production d'électricité, mais aussi pour nous assurer que peu importe ce qui arrive au niveau de la production de pétrole et de gaz, les émissions, elles, diminuent pour qu'on puisse atteindre nos objectifs.
The Environment Commissioner yesterday found that of the 55 large emitters in the country, only 15 applied for the Net Zero Accelerator Fund and only 2 actually signed on. They said the program is too cumbersome. Are you willing to make the program easier so that we can get bigger emitters on board?
I think we are working with big emitters as the tens of billions of dollars show that are being invested, but I think we can always do better, and we will be happy to work to ensure that our program is as efficient as possible.
What do you think about the latest announcement from the Quebec government regarding the protection of caribou? And the deadline is today to submit strategies. If it's not done by the end of the day, do you plan to intervene?
So the Quebec government has presented something, and we are in the process of analyzing it. What I have said publicly is that I'm disappointed to see that the strategy only covers a certain number of caribou population in Quebec and doesn't show how the Quebec government will meet its own commitment to ensure that at least 35% of lands where we find caribous are undisturbed. So we will be looking at what the Quebec government has presented, but right now, I'm worried that it falls short of what they were supposed to present.
En français là-dessus, est-ce que vous avez l'intention d'intervenir? Vous êtes clairement déçu du plan de Québec là, présenté cette semaine.
Bien, ce que j'ai dit, c'est que le gouvernement du Québec s'est engagé dans une lettre conjointe que nous avons signée à protéger au moins 35 % et à faire en sorte que 35 % de l'habitat du caribou ne soit pas impacté par l'activité humaine. Dans ce qui a été présenté, c'est dur de voir comment on arrive à atteindre ça. Et ce que Québec a présenté ne concerne que quelques-unes des populations de caribou et pas l'ensemble des populations de caribou. Moi, j'ai une obligation législative, donc en fonction de la loi fédérale. Si une province ne protège pas l'habitat d'une espèce en péril, je dois aller au cabinet et demander un décret d'urgence. Alors là, on va évaluer. Il faut prendre le temps d'évaluer ce que Québec a proposé, mais ça paraît un peu mince.
The federal government given up on carbon capture and storage. There's a company that's just shelved its plans. There's the Pathways Alliance. It's having trouble getting a reaction from you. Are you giving up on that path?
So first, if you read the National Inventory Report, you'll show that carbon capture and storage has contributed to 7 million tons of pollution being sucked out of the atmosphere. So it is happening in Canada, but it's not the be-all, end-all of fighting for climate change. It's one of 150 measures that we're putting in place, and we think that it can play a role, but it won't fix our climate change problem.
I mean, they're asking for more policy response from the federal government.
I think we're putting our money where our mouth is, and I would like to see industry do the same. There's billions of dollars of federal money to help these companies invest in carbon capture and storage. We are seeing some investment, but if we're talking about Pathway, we still don't know, and they've been talking about this for 2 years. We still don't know what their investment will be, and I think we've made good on our promise. There's lots of money on the table for them. They need to put some of their own money as well.
d'émissions, sur le plafond d'émissions pour le pétrole et le gaz, pourquoi pas faire ça, je veux juste attendre que ça se termine, pourquoi pas avant 2026? Pourquoi attendre 2026 pour le plafond d'émissions sur le pétrole et le gaz?
Non, bien, ce que nous faisons présentement, c'est que nous développons la réglementation pour le plafond.
Ça répond en vigueur
Ce que nous avons dit, c'est que le plafond allait plafonner les émissions au niveau actuel autour de 2021. Alors, même si, je veux dire, d'un point de vue, il faut suivre les procédures parlementaires et les procédures du gouvernement, il faut mettre en place la réglementation, mais même si le règlement n'entrerait en vigueur qu'en 2026, ce qui est encore hypothétique à ce point-ci, il plafonnerait les émissions au niveau d'autour de 2021, comme nous nous sommes engagés à le faire lors de la dernière campagne électorale.
David? Oil and gas continues to contribute for the bulk of our emissions.
That's correct.
When are we going to see the draft regs for the oil and gas cap?
By the fall, as we've said, those regulations are coming, and they are good news when you look at oil and gas. Methane emissions are going down in the oil and gas sector. They will need to come down substantially more, and they will be coming down substantially more in the coming years because of things like our regulations for the reduction of methane emissions by at least 40% by 2025. And remember that what we're looking at in the inventory report is 2022 data. And by the way, on methane, part of the reason that the emissions have increased between 2021 and 2022 is because we've revised our methane methodology to be in a position to better detect methane emissions. We're using aerial surveys now. Canada is at the cutting edge of methane measurement. To ensure that, because we've known for many years that methane was being underreported, and the IPCC has said that, and we're deploying a lot of efforts to ensure that we are getting the most accurate measurement as we can.
The Environmental Impact Assessment Act. Yesterday, environmental groups said that the amendments narrowed the scope more than the Supreme Court was requiring you to do, and that it takes out entirely greenhouse gases as a factor. What is your response to this, that they said in their letter to Cabinet?
I respectfully disagree with my ex-colleague of the environmental movement on that. The Supreme Court was very clear that in its previous form, the Impact Assessment Act went too far in terms of imposing federal oversight over provincial projects. And people have to remember that when what was called at the time C-69 was adopted, we didn't have methane regulations in Canada. We didn't have a zero-emission vehicle standard in Canada. We didn't have a clean fuel standard in Canada. We weren't working on clean electricity regulation or a cap on oil and gas emissions. All of these things have been developed since the Impact Assessment Act was adopted in 2019. So we have an arsenal of measures now to tackle climate change pollution, whether it's from the transportation sector, the industrial sector, or the oil and gas sector.
The Commissioner found that your department isn't adequately tracking whether their programs are working.
I missed the beginning of the question.
The Commissioner says that your department isn't adequately tracking whether your environmental programs are working, you're doing incomplete data collection, and that you have an insufficient measurement framework. What do you say to that?
We're working, the emissions reduction report that we presented in 2022 was the most detailed and transparent exercise like this in the history of Canada. We provided an update. We're increasing as I was talking about methane and methodology, we're investing to ensure that we have the best-in-class measurement for methane. So I think we can always do better, and we are, in fact, doing better. Vraiment désolé, je dois aller.
Dernière question. Quand vous avez vu les chiffres, l'augmentation en 2021 et 2022, est-ce qu'il y avait quand même une partie de vous, je comprends que c'était attendu, mais est-ce qu'il y avait une partie de vous qui était un peu déçue? Bien,
écoutez, j'étais très heureux de voir que, en sachant très bien qu'il allait y avoir une augmentation parce que l'économie reprenait, que cette augmentation-là était en deçà de ce que nos experts prévoyaient, Environnement et Changement climatique Canada, ainsi qu'à l'Institut du climat. Je suis vraiment désolé, je dois aller voter, mais on peut se reparler avec plaisir.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci tout le monde.